think in the interest of making good use of everyone's time, we'll just go ahead and others can join in if they arrive. So I'm Mark Berry. Many of you either on your way in or previously. I'm the president here at Schoodic Institute and very much looking forward to tonight's workshop with Jagels, who I was happy to meet actually in my last job when I worked on the Grand Lake Stream, which is a favorite fishing destination. So we had a connection from that, and he offered to come down here and do a workshop, and I pretty enthusiastically accepted. And as you likely already know, he's a professor in the University of Maine School of Forest Resources, Emeritus now.
Right.
And also a regular contributor to WoodenBoat magazine. And I think we can learn a lot from him tonight. I know I'm looking forward to it. And I'll turn it over with no more ceremony. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to start off by, wood is a really broad topic, obviously, to try to cover in 2 hours. So what I'd like to do is go around the room, just introduce yourself briefly, and indicate maybe why you chose to come tonight or any particular issues about wood that you'd like to have explored, because I'll have a canned part at the beginning, but then I'd like to open it up and go in various directions that people are interested in. And while I'm doing that, I have 2 pieces of wood here that are hammer handles. They're been cut down, obviously. They're both white ash, and they're labeled A and B. And pass them around, look at them, and if you were to go to the hardware store, which one would you choose? That's the question. And we'll come back to that issue later. So why don't you start?
My name's Morris Schuster. I live in Steuben, and I just thought I'd pick up some tips, obviously from you tonight, woodworking or whatever. I suppose that would be my general interest.
Okay.
My name is Meg. My fiance Tyler works here at Schoodic too, so we came, to be involved with the institute. It's good for me to kind of see the grounds and everything. But we actually just moved to the state of Maine from Massachusetts, and I think we're really working on learning more about being self-sufficient, and so learning more about natural resources like wood, I think, is pretty important to us.
Okay. Tyler, you want to say anything?
Sure. My name's Tyler. I guess what I'm most interested in learning tonight is, I guess, just like basic wood identification. Is something that I'm lacking in, so I think that would be really good for me, just from standpoint of a novice within field identification of wood. I guess is something I'm interested in.
I'm Tim. I'm actually a woodworker by profession, and always interested in picking up more knowledge.
I've already introduced myself. I'm Mark. I just talk about my interest per se. Obviously, I have an interest in being here in my role for the Institute, but I also have plenty of interest in wood unrelated to that. I used to do a fair amount of carving. I don't do as much of that anymore. That's how I dabble in wood.
Sorry.
My name is Andrew Straz. I'm a civil structural engineer by training, amateur woodworker. So more interested in properties than lately it's more woodworking than anything else.
Well, I've testified in a lot of cases involving wood engineering.
Hi, I'm Mike Sukup. I was for 3 years the president here, and then I retired for the 2nd time. And I've got to have something to do now, so I'm thinking. I found an old boat, a 1932 18-foot sailboat on the side of the road in Gouldsboro, and I'm not so sure it's going to float, so I thought I'd come and get some help.
That's not the one sticking half out of the ground, is it?
No, it's complete. And the road's 18. It's a very interesting old boat. And if things don't go well, I'll just drag it over to WoodenBoat School and see if on top. The and boat, I guess.
I'm Mike Sommer. I live right in Prospect Harbor. I'm retired amateur woodworker, mostly wood turner. I do a lot with blade work and mostly with foam wood, a lot of cherry and maple, whatever I can get my hands on is what I put on the lathe and make round.
My name is Jana. I'm started in August as a stewardship director for the Island Heritage Trust in Deer Isle. So it's very important for me to identify wood, especially when I'm out in the field. And I come from more of a environmental planning background, so learning the field part of it is really important for me.
My name is Nathan Richards, and I do a lot of woodworking, not professionally, but the extra time I've got, and really enjoy it. And basically would like to hear from you a lot of things that I don't already know, as I'm sure a lot of people do. Thank you.
I'm Pat Close, and my husband works with woods, and I just thought I'd like to be able to identify some of these woods when he's finished turning them, so that I would understand the patterns and be able to help him price them for our guests.
And I'm Jim Close. I do wood turning mostly as a hobby and mostly from found wood, although I have begun now to buy some blanks as well.
Bob Weber, live up on Route 1 in Wilkesboro. I'm from a big city. I don't know anything about trees, and I've been here since '71. They always talk about ash and poplar and hackmattack, and this is good for that, and this is not good for that. And I'm not doing anything with it, but I like to know about it. So, at least understand what they're saying.
Bell, career. The only thing I got for wood is to burn it, stay warm, especially this time of the year. And they learn something every day.
My name is Chris Sprague. I work as a vocational trade instructor at Downey's Correctional Facility, and I thought this was a symposium on how to get rid of snow. No, no, I just want to get some more education on wood. Never can learn enough.
Okay, well, we'll let that one continue around. I think we'll just start with sort of the canned presentation, and then what I want to do is, first let me say something about the handouts. This handout here is part of a longer paper I did when I was on sabbatical number 2006 at the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. And it really was geared for plantation growing, but at the beginning I went into just the basic properties and the different kinds of wood. So a lot of what I'm going to show up here, you don't really need to take notes on that much. It's in here. Including at the very end something about, nobody mentioned musical instruments, so we may or may not go into that at all, but something about violins on the back page here. The other handout is sort of a brief schematic of what I'll be talking about in terms of the 4 basic types of wood that we have. And then the other pages in here are taken from something called the Wood Handbook, which is this book here. Any of you familiar with it? Yeah, the engineer. But this is a book that a lot of people think of as being intimidating to use, but in fact it's extremely helpful. You don't need to write anything down about it because I'm going to have it around to look at. And the other thing is that this is put out by the Forest Products Laboratory about every 10 years. They update it. It's been going since the 30s. And really, if you want to know anything about wood, like I've got some wood. Is it decay resistant? Right in here in the chart, we'll look at that. What are its strength properties? How do those compare with some other wood? Basically anything you want to know, drying wood, anything. This one was put out in '99, I believe, and there's an updated version that's this one. that came out about 3 or 4 years ago. 2010. There's very little difference between these two. This one you can get by going online and ordering it from the Forest Product Research Society, and it will cost you about $75 plus shipping. Because it's in the public domain, anyone can reprint it. And a friend of mine, any of you know about Lee Valley Tools? Leonard Lee is a friend of mine. And so I coaxed him into reprinting this edition. And it's available from them for $35 or so. But he was running down to the end of this batch, and I bought the remainder from him for $25. So I have them in my truck if anyone wants one for $25. It's a good buy. That's my sales pitch for tonight. I'll talk about some other books later, particularly about identifying wood when we get to that part. I know that some of you have come with the idea that you're going to learn a lot about identifying wood. It's a process that takes a very long time. I've been at it for my whole life practically. I took several courses at university on it, and I can still be stumped, especially if I get into foreign woods. I can do any U.S. wood. But that's what we can learn tonight are some what you look for, what are factors, what are the things you can see with a hand lens. You can't really positively identify a wood just with a hand lens. You really need a microscope. So some woods you can get very close or probably get that way. I never, in any kind of paid consultancy or anything, I never do anything with just a hand lens. I always look at the microscope. So you're not going to become experts, you're not going to become even novices tonight on wood identification. I just want to set that out ahead. But we'll give you sort of how you can go about it. And one really good book, which is this one called Identifying Wood by Bruce Hoadley. He has another book on wood properties also, which is a nice book to have. So if you really want to follow up on it at all, this is a book to have. Now this one, the nice thing about this book is there's a lot of color photographs which are about what you would see with a hand lens. So he lets you get pretty far along with a hand lens on it. For those who want to go further, there are a number of books that have keys that involve microscopic and hand lens identification. These are old ones, but they haven't really, things like that haven't changed that much. And they happen to be the same book, but just 2 different editions. And I already own 2 more of them. So if anyone wants them, they're free tonight. And I'd be happy for someone to take them, and I don't have to take them back home. Okay, I think that's most of it on the books. The other book by Bruce Hoadley is called Understanding Wood, and that covers a lot of things that we'll just talk about tonight about wood. Okay, so let's jump into this. Well, we need to say something about trees if we're going to talk about wood, because wood, of course, is a product of trees. And the way in which trees grow determines in many ways the properties of the wood that's produced. So trees, of course, evolved to get above the other vegetation to get enough light. And so they produced this woody stem. Now the woody stem is, even in the living tree, is only partly living cells. Most of the cells are dead already. And we'll look at that, where there is living or dead tissue. Climate changes over time, and of course even now can change the way in which trees grow. So that in the tropics, many trees grow, in the wet tropics grow continuously, so they don't produce any rings. So we don't have annual rings to look at to age a tree in the tropics. It's very difficult sometimes to unless they grow in a wet-dry area and then they go through some kind of cycling. But the wet-dry cycles may not be annual, they may be a couple times a year or several years apart. We have different kinds of trees that have adapted to different climates. So in the tropics, we're going to talk about something called diffuse forest hardwoods and green forest hardwoods. Green forest hardwoods are almost entirely absent in the tropics. There's a few, but they're very important in this area, and they have adapted a lot for the climate we have, in which they are dormant for a good portion of the year right now, of course, and drop their leaves, and this is a way that they can get water up to the top of the tree very quickly. And then even within a particular species, people often think that if you know a particular species, then you know what its properties are. And we'll see tonight how that can be very misleading, that in fact the properties can change a great deal in terms of how they've been growing. So just to start really at very basic thing, when we're looking at wood, whether we're using it to make something, furniture or boats or whatever, or whether we want to look at it in terms of identification, we always look at one of three sections, either the transverse or cross section. And that's the one that's probably the most useful for hand lens identification. In fact, it's the prominent one that we use for hand lens identification. We can also cut wood tangent to the growth rings. You can see out here. Or we can cut it as if it were spokes in a wheel, that is from the pith or the center of the tree out to the bark along any of the radii. And the wood has different properties on these, in whether we cut it tangentially or radially. Tangential sections are often called flat sawn by woodworkers, plain sawn. Radial is sometimes called quarter sawn. So these are the basic ways. But of course, when you buy a board that's been cut from a lumber yard, it could be some skew of one of these planes. So you may not get a true tangential plane, or you may not get a true radial plane. And that can affect how that board reacts under various conditions. Now, just a little sort of basic anatomy here. Let me go back here. I forgot. In addition to the planes of the wood, we can see here that there's a region out here that's the bark. And then we have an area of wood that's lighter in color, and then a darker color wood inside that. Now, not all trees have this color differentiation, but they all have this distinction of sapwood and heartwood. So in this particular case, sapwood is this white color. And it contains still, although it has many dead cells, it also contains some living cells, that is parenchyma cells, which are storing starch, and that starch is released whenever the cambium, which is the layer between the sapwood and the bark, begins growing or continues growing. The cambium, we'll see in this next slide, is the growing layer of the tree. And so it produces cells. This would be the cambium region. Cells to the outside will be bark, and cells to the inside are wood. And the first several rings will be sapwood, and then eventually the parenchyma cells in the sapwood die, and then it becomes heartwood. And at the point that sapwood converts to heartwood, quite often there's also production of various chemicals that are infused into the wood, and it's these chemicals that give certain woods decay resistance. But that really points out the fact that all sapwood is decay prone. There really isn't any sapwood that has decay resistance. It's only heartwood. So if you're buying cedar, or in the case of the wood we just looked at, which is mental block here, but anyway, oaks, some oaks, white oak, for instance, cherry, walnut. These are all woods that have decay-resistant heartwood. But if you're buying wood for decking, say a cedar, you need to be careful about the fact that you're getting basically heartwood, which is very little, if any, sapwood, because that sapwood is not decay-resistant. So the basic structure of wood is that it's made up of a filamentous thread-like structure, cellulose, and that cellulose is sort of glued together with something called lignin. And so cellulose is broken down into two categories: alpha cellulose, which is the strongest, and then hemicelluloses, which are sort of weaker. So in a sense, what we have is a natural composite. So if you bought a fiberglass fishing rod or now a carbon fiber fishing rod, these are basically modeled on the structure of wood, in which you have a fiber embedded in a matrix, and that gives you the strength that you want in particular directions. So it is a directional strength that wood has, and so it has much more strength. It has a lot of strength and tension, but less strength across the grain. So, and it shrinks and swells differently in different directions, as we'll get to in a minute. And that's why we sometimes do something like make plywood or some other engineered wood in order to even out those kinds of directional things. I don't think we need to mention too much about that. So, because cellulose is this long chain polymer and lignin is a glue that sort of binds it together, you can sort of think of it as a bunch of straws, because the cells are in fact hollow, that are all glued together to form a bundle, and that then is the basis of wood. But within each of these cells are the cellulose itself may be arranged in different ways, and we'll talk about how that can affect the strength. So, as we've already talked about, model for industrial composites. Now, just to look at one particular feature of wood, and that is how it shrinks and swells in different directions. This, by the way, is from the Wood Handbook. It gives you a really nice view of how wood dries down in different directions. So if you have a nice radial cut board, it's not going to cup and warp very much at all. It's going to shrink fairly evenly. And this is why boat builders and guitar makers and so on want to always have radial cut wood if they can get it, or quarter sawn wood. If you have flat sawn wood, on the other hand, or tangential cut, it will warp in that way. So it warps somewhat counterintuitively in the opposite direction of the way the rings are going. And that often throws people off and confuses them. So if you're making a deck, you want to have it cupping so that it's blowing up and not cupped so it catches water. People sometimes mistake which way it goes and put it in the wrong way. So once we have then an idea of the fact that we have wood, we then can look more carefully at different kinds of wood. And trees evolved over a very long period of time, and so they evolved different kinds of wood. gymnosperms are much older than angiosperms. So the conifers that we know, pines, spruce, large cedars, trees basically with needles on them, have been around much, much longer. And they have a much more simple kind of wood, which we refer to as homogeneous wood, that they have just one cell type that both carries water to the top of the tree and provides support for the trunk. On the other hand, angiosperms, and we'll look at that in more detail in a minute, angiosperms have become more specialized, so they have some cells that are for support, fibers, fiber tracheates, and other cells that are involved in conducting water to the top of the tree, and those are vessels. Dicots are what we know as our broadleaf trees, oaks, ash, maples, and known as hardwoods in the tree. This term hardwood and softwood, of course, is very confusing, but it's been around for so long that we stick with it. We can see here a softwood that is, in fact, extremely light, and another one that's extremely heavy. Beam, this is southern yellow pine, and this is dawn redwood. Possibly the only canoe paddle ever made from dawn redwood. I'll talk about dawn redwood in a minute. So, if we look then at the anatomy of these trees, and this then becomes the basis of wood identification, that is, that different trees have different kinds of cells, different arrangements of cells, and different sizes of particular cells. So, for instance, if we're looking at a gymnosperm or a conifer, we have this type of cell here and this type of cell here. They're both tracheids. These are tracheids that are produced early in the growing season to form what we call early wood, or it used to be called spring wood. And these are thicker walled and smaller lumen, formed later in the season and referred to as late wood. But those are the only kinds of cells that make up 90-some% of the wood. The rest is a small amount of parenchyma. Whereas in hardwoods, we have vessels, and these vessels can be very fat and large in diameter. They can be narrower in diameter, even much narrower than are shown here. And then we have fibers, which are these thick-walled cells that are involved in support. Now, when looking in a hand lens, we wouldn't be able to see this difference here. That is, this scleriform perforation plate versus a simple perforation plate. You have to go to a microscope to see that. You have to go to a microscope to see the kind of pitting on the side walls of things. So a lot of the features that we can see right here, we simply can't see with a hand lens, so we're limited as to how far we can carry wood identification with just a hand lens, but we can do a fair amount. Now, probably the most important thing that I could try to get across tonight is getting the sense that really all woods fall into one of four categories. Once you sort of have an idea of which category it falls into, you know something about its basic adaptations to the environment, and in particular, you know something about whether it's growing rapidly or slowly, how that will affect its strength properties. Now, before we get into that, let me ask on these two that were passed around, how many thought A was the stronger and you would pick? And how many would have picked B? Well, B is the answer. I'll explain that why in a minute. Always works out this way. The problem is that we've come to believe that old growth forests produce the best quality wood. And that's true in some ways, but not always. It's more true for conifers and either has no bearing or is wrong for many hardwoods, especially ring porous hardwoods. And we'll see that now as we look at these. So basically then we have this woods like that I've mentioned, oak, hickory, ash, elm, where you can see this kind of porous structure at the beginning of the growth ring that you saw on these. You have diffuse porous hardwoods, which are more what people call even grained woods, cherry, birch, beech, poplar, and most tropical woods. And then in conifers, we have woods that have a very well-pronounced late wood, such as southern pine and Douglas fir, versus ones that, like white pine, that are almost even across the growth ring. Let's look at these in a little more detail. This is examples of ring porous hardwoods. And so early in the season, they produce this wood here, which we refer to as early wood. And the strategy of this is that these vessels are extremely efficient in moving water. In fact, based on physical theory, they're 4 times, to the 4th power of the diameter. So in efficiency, so you could just improve the diameter a little bit, and that would raise it to the 4th power over what it was before. So all you have to do is make these a lot larger, or even twice as large as these in the late wood, and they become extremely efficient. So they can get water up to the top of the tree very, very fast for leaf out. And so a lot of our temperate zone woods are ring porous. They're not all ring porous, though, as we know, because we have things like maple that grows around here along with oak, and maple is able to compete very well with others. Maple has a different strategy. What is that? Anyone know? It's related to the maple syrup industry. They actually break down starch, dump it into the vessels. That creates an osmotic imbalance. Water is drawn into those vessels and builds up the pressure in the stem and gets it. In fact, if you go to a maple tree in spring, you can see it dripping out the tips of the branches and taste it. It's sweet. So at that one time of year, the vessels serve not only to carry water, they're actually carrying sugar, but they're not really carrying it anywhere because there's no leaves yet. They're just building up a pressure inside the stem. So there are other strategies, but certainly one of the strategies that has been adopted in the temperate region is these ring porous hardwoods. Now it turns out that this zone for any particular species is more or less fixed. So, for instance, in American elm, it would just be one row of early wood forest, and that's one way you would know you're probably looking at an elm, especially if we saw some other features. Whereas in some others, it may be 3 or 4 cells wide, or in others even maybe a little wider. But that zone is pretty much the same year after year, no matter how fast the tree is growing. What does change is the amount of late wood. So in this tree here, we have from here on is late wood, and in this tree, it's only from here to there. And it's the late wood that provides the strength to the wood. As you can see, it's a much weaker wood. It's all open airspace pretty much. So in ring porous hardwoods, it's the wider growth rings that give you the stronger wood. In fact, baseball bats are graded based on that kind of thinking. So here's a baseball bat that's actually made to be used. You can see the ring width on it. And here's a souvenir baseball bat that just shows all the reject wood to make real narrow growth rings. We can pass that around also. By the way, baseball bats are changing a lot now. They have to be wood, of course, for the major leagues, but ash was always the norm, but what wood are many of them using now? Anyone follow baseball at all? Maple, hard maple. And the reason is that, actually, if I could just have that back for a second, just the big one. You can see there's a label on here. It's always put on the same face. It's always on the tangential face. That's because when you hold the bat, you look at the bat, and then when you swing, you're hitting the opposite face, which is also a tangential face. So that gives you the strength and avoids splitting the bat if you were to hit it on the radial face. But baseball players don't like to have shiny bats to look at, so they paint their bats black. They have no idea what face they're using, and they don't even pay attention to the label anymore. And they split all their bats. And they're splitting bats like crazy. Really. So they've gone to maple, because you don't have to worry about it. And maple is a diffuse porous hardwood, which I'll get to right now. So here we have a diffuse porous hardwood. And it could have big vessels, but they're the same all the way across, more or less. This is actually a semi-diffuse, semi-reinforced wood. We call it a semi-diffuse porous. It's sort of intermediate. Here's a perfectly good example. This is birch, and maple would look very much like this. So you have vessels that are the same pretty much across the growth rings. It doesn't matter if it's got a wide ring or a narrow ring. In maple and birch and things like that, you don't have to worry about ring width. And to give you a good example of how that has played out for me in the past, back in the 80s, I was called in on a lot of cases that involved roofing jacks. These gadgets here, which you've all probably seen. And they were failing on this beam. And so the question was, is there some abnormal wood? Are they leaving them outside too long and starting to decay, or what? Turned out that these are all made out of oak. They were not selecting oak, and they were just getting a lot of narrow ring oak beams up here. Now, probably in the past, people who knew wood and have been making it, many of our industries in Maine are family-run businesses that pass on, and the younger generation inherits it but doesn't know anything about the business often. And so they were failing a lot, and I pointed out it's almost certainly due to this narrow ring oak that they're using there. So the solution was, okay, well, some of them just went to making metal ones. Proofers hate those metal ones. They can't fold them anyway. So they put a metal beam here, and they put these little nubbins in there to try to keep the board from sliding around, but that doesn't last very long. The board starts sliding all over the place. And so they hated these things. They lasted for a little while, and then finally, I think OSHA probably got involved also at this point. So you have now this very elaborate thing, which has another thing up here, which you put a little spike through and hold the plank. You have a lock down here, and it's not made out of oak anymore. It's maple. Don't have to worry about ring width any longer. So hopefully those examples will make you remember about ring porous and diffuse porous woods. Now, within the conifers, we have the same sort of thing, and then we have, unfortunately, this slide is sort of upside down, so think of it growing in the other direction now, but, oh no, this is right. So, here's the early wood produced, and then later in the season it produces late wood. But in conifers, it's the early wood that varies, not the late wood. So the late wood is more fixed. It's not totally fixed in that if you went to look at, I'll show a slide in a minute, that sometimes this late wood can be a little wider or a little narrower depending upon the soil type and other competition and so on. But what always varies quite a bit depending upon moisture, that growing season, or other things. It's the early wood, and so you can have this spring. You don't have a lot of variation here, but this spring here that's fairly narrow, and this one's a bit wider. Here you can see one that's quite wide on a different tree. So in abrupt transition softwoods particularly, that is woods in which there's a fairly dramatic change between what the early wood looks like and what the late wood looks like, where these cells are all those thick-walled tracheas versus these are all thin-walled and larger diameter tracheas. Again, it's the early wood that's weak, but it's the early wood that's varying, not the late wood. And so in conifers, it's a narrow ring material that's rather than holding up blocks up front here. So here you can see in this tree you have very wide growth rings, relatively narrow late wood also. Here you have much slower growth, much less late wood. Late wood is even somewhat more pronounced. And here you have an extreme of that in longleaf pine. These are all southern yellow pine. This is old growth longleaf pine where you have very wide amounts of late wood and very little early wood, or about half and half. This wood is much stronger. Now you'll notice in the center of the tree, it's different. This is also near the center of the tree. We'll come back to that issue in a minute of something called juvenile wood. It's something we like to avoid in conifers, particularly abrupt transition conifers. Oh, this is. So the other kind of conifer we have is gradual transition softwoods, in which the early wood and late wood are not very well differentiated. And this is our eastern white pine. These are something called resin canals, which are a feature that allows to separate one kind of conifer from another. Some have resin canals and some lack resin canals. Here's also what we call a gradual transition. It's actually a little bit more pronounced late wood than here, but again, ring width in those woods is less important. And in fact, they tend to be low density woods anyway, our eastern white pines. So we're not usually using them for their very high strength properties. We would pick something like Douglas fir or southern yellow pine or tamarack or something like that. The strength is what we really wanted. And sometimes strength is not what we want. What we want is lightweight. So here's a canoe paddle that would be nice to work with all day because it's so light. You wouldn't want to use it in white water exactly, but if you're just paddling on the lake. This is made out of dawn redwood. Anyone know about dawn redwood? Back in around 1999, I was involved in a research project in the high Arctic, an axle hybrid island, which is 10 degrees from the pole, 80 degrees north. And there's a fossil forest up there composed of almost entirely dawn redwood. This is a piece of that fossil wood. You can pass it around. You can see it's a bit heavier because it's actually deteriorated. It's on its way to becoming coal, but it's still wood, and we can identify it actually microscopically and tell for certain that it is dawn redwood. Dawn redwood is a species it's actually closer to bald cypress than redwood, but they're all in the same general grouping. And it was thought to be extinct. It was only known as a fossil until about the 1940s when it was discovered by outsiders in a remote area of China where it still survived. And it's now planted all over the world. I have 3 of them on my property in Winterport. It survived in this climate. It's not ideal for it, but more like the mid-Atlantic states are sort of the ideal climate for it. It's got a quite low density. It is decay resistant. It's actually slightly lighter than cedar. So this is from a tree that was growing in New Jersey that was cut down. But Brent was on my friend's property. He put another researcher on this boy. And so I had Shaw and Tenney make, at that time when Shaw and Tenney was still owned by Paul Reagan, if you took him a wood he'd never made a canoe paddle out of, and you gave him enough to make 2 canoe paddles, he'd give you one for free. So sometimes lightness is more important than, especially if you're building a boat, how much weight the wood is depends on how high or low the boat rides in the water, and, or how heavy it is to carry, or any other thing. So it isn't always strength that you're looking for. And in fact, going back to the oak problem again, in Germany they grow oaks extremely slowly because they turn it into veneer, and they like the pattern that those narrow rings produce for veneer, where they're not concerned about strength, they're just concerned about the aesthetics of what that veneer looks like. Okay, so I guess I should say one more last thing about rainforest hardwoods. When the British settlers first settled this part of New England in general, they started building boats out of oak because that's what they used in England. And the quality was just not there, the strength wasn't there. And now you know why. The British oaks were hedge-grown oaks out in the open, growing rapidly, full sun. They'd get all their compass timbers out and everything for the boat. What were the settlers seeing here? Old growth forests, crowded trees, slow growth. It wasn't the species difference, it was this rapid versus slow growth that they were seeing. So we've talked about the 4 wood types. I'll talk a little bit about 2 other things. Juvenile wood, since it's becoming more and more of a problem. Internal stresses in hardwoods, which aren't as much of a problem in this country, but are becoming a problem for plantations throughout the world where exotics are being planted in different places. Then a few other little things, and then we kind of open up for some other things. One of the problems over time is that as we grow wood, where we try to maximize the yield from forests, particularly coniferous forests, and particularly things like Douglas fir and southern pine, which are so important, and even our spruces and firs here, but less so. We tend not to muscle them along that much. We have tried growing tamarack in Maine to try to get a rapid growth wood, but in the south and in the west, where they really manage for forest for high yield, you end up then with this more rapid growth wood. And not only is it weaker, but it has a lot more juvenile wood in it, which we'll talk about in a minute. This one toward the center of the tree. And so to get around that, over time we've started to make a lot more engineered wood products. So instead of managing the forest to get the best quality wood, we manage it to get the best yield. And then we have to take care of the problem of quality after the fact. So for a long time we've had plywood, and that was really a product designed really so that we had could have a sheet of wood that was larger in various dimensions and we would get out of a board and we would make the properties the same in all directions, more or less. So instead of having wood that has properties that are anisotropic or directional in one direction, they are now the same in all directions pretty much. And that product's been around for a long time, and the quality has changed over time some. In particular, for instance, like marine plywood, at one time it had no voids in it, but voids actually are allowed, and so a lot of marine plywood does have voids in it. But even construction grade plywood or AC plywood, which would be plywood with an A face, which is supposed to be not free and perfect, and a C face, which is used for a lot of things like cabinet work or whatever, was mostly made out of Douglas fir for many, many years. But the southern pine people wanted to get into the market. And so in the 80s, they were finally able to convince, southern pine tends to, because of the rapid growth southern pine, tends to be somewhat weaker than most of the Douglas fir that was being grown at that time. All that's changing also. But they got into the market by saying, well, we'll make 3/4 inch plywood with 7 plies instead of 5 plies, which is what most of the Douglas fir was. And that way we'll take care of this juvenile wood problem and the strength problems and so on. And so in the mid-80s, I should have bought up a truckload of this stuff, because by the late 80s, it was coming out like this. Huge voids, 5 ply, just garbage. That's what happens in these fields, and you have to be very aware of that changing picture all the time that's happening. So at the time that was happening, at that time, most of the Douglas fir that was coming out was looking like this, and now a lot of it looks like this. And these are both actually from Douglas fir is starting to be marketed in this area, which it hadn't been for many, many years. And this is from Lowe's, actually, I believe. I bought like 6 months ago. They're both called Select Stud, whatever that means. But you can see there's a huge difference. You can feel the weight difference also. And so this would be a good strong 2x4, and this is garbage. Now, along with that, another thing happened. So they just have to meet a minimum strength to pass this stuff off. So when you go to the lumber yard and pick out your Douglas fir or whatever softwood, you should be looking for something more like this than something like this. Now, you'll notice something here. Part of this is missing. Why? That's right. It's called wane. That's where the bark was. And what happened? That's the best stuff to pick up, and everyone avoids it. I don't want something with the corner cut off. That's from the outside of the tree. You know that right away. It's not in the center of the tree where it's rapid growth juvenile wood. It's going to do this kind of thing. This is what happens with a lot of pressure treated wood that's treated and then shipped green, and they open the pile up and the boards go flying, as it's dried out along the way. This you can see is from fairly close to the center of the tree. Actually, you can see the pith right here. So it has what's called juvenile wood, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute. So a lot of lumberyards won't accept this wood anymore, even though it's the best quality wood, because the buyer keeps throwing it off to the side of the pile and take it. It's too bad. That's just the way things go. And he passes around with it.
Missing a little bit of wood, even though we know where that comes from. It actually still, you have more strength.
That's actually much stronger than this, and it's not going to warp and twist and pop all the nails in your sheetrock when you build with it, which this other stuff will. Well, we pretty much all this stuff here, the rainforest and wide rings are stronger, these porous, independent of ring width, abrupt transitions up with narrow rings. But here you can see actually one ring where you have quite well displayed this wide ring here versus this very narrow ring here, and then a sort of intermediate ring above it, where you had obviously some different growing conditions, probably a drought in that narrow ring here. So if you only have one or two narrow rings, it's not a big deal, but if it's all narrow rings, then the ring core is hard to pass. This is the stuff here that passing around. Actually, this is a beam out of an old building in the Boston area that's from Longleaf yellow pine. Can't get that stuff. Let me just do the juvenile one and then we'll come back to that. So, what happens when a tree grows? It oh, here it is. So in the I should draw this here. In the individual cells, the tracheas, that is border pits. By the way, how does the way in which conifers are actually able to transport water from one cell to another because they don't have an open end, is that another cell has to overlap it, and then they have these bordered pits that connect one cell to the other. So it's a very slow and inefficient way of getting water to the top of the tree, but it's also much safer. And one of the reasons it's safer is that they have bordered pits. Basically, these are little valves. This is an exploded view of a bordered pit. So one cell's on this side, the other cell's on this side, and it has to pass through this sort of meshwork area here from here and come out through here. And if the pressure changes in the tree, if you get an embolism or an air bubble and you get a pressure drop, this valve closes against the pit opening and stops the rest of the column from collapsing. So conifers evolved at a time when they didn't have any competition from hardwoods, and they opted for the safe way of getting water to the top of trees. It means they can't grow quite as fast, and that's why they're relegated to our northern forests and pretty much absent except for very dry areas in the tropics. So wet tropics, where the hardwood really just took off and just out-competed all the conifers pretty much. Now here, the competition is a little more even because conifers keep their leaves, except for things like larch or Anisotropic, redwood, that drop their leaves. Most conifers retain them in the winter, and actually if you get a nice sunny day that's close to or above freezing, they'll actually photosynthesize, and they're of course ready to go when spring comes. They don't have to produce new leaves, so that's their one advantage. But their ability to move water to the tree rapidly is their disadvantage. Anyway, coming back to the trachea, within the trachea we have cellulose bundles that are in the wall, and these cellulose microfibrils can be arranged more or less longitudinally with just a very small angle off of the vertical or longitudinal, or they can be arranged at some angle like this. It turns out that when trees are just starting to grow and are producing these wide rings where they have plenty of light and everything, which is usually the case, they produce this kind of microfibrils that are at an angle from the vertical that's larger. And it turns out that this wood then responds differently than mature wood. And one of the most significant ways it is different is that the way that wood shrinks and swells is that water gets into the interstices between these microfibrils and causes them to move apart. So swelling of wood is water moving into these microfibrils and moving them apart. Well, if they're mostly arranged close to longitudinal, that means that all the shrinking and swelling will be in the tangential and radial direction, and wood won't shrink. And we always say wood doesn't shrink longitudinally. Well, that's true for mature wood, but for juvenile wood or conifers particularly, where you have this sort of microfibril arrangement, wood can shrink and swell longitudinally. And so it's a mixture of shrinking in these various directions that causes, forget the intro, this sort of thing. So here we have, I guess we'll look at this. Here we have the center of the tree. These first few rings are clearly juvenile wood, and then we're getting into more mature wood as we go out. So this wood out here doesn't shrink longitudinally, but this wood in here does. And that's what causes it to, in this case, not only cup, but not only bend in one direction, but in the other direction, because this is off-center. If this were perfectly centered, then it would just bend this way, or if it were over here, then it would bend this way. But this is sort of in the middle, so it's bending both ways. And that's really a huge problem in construction-grade lumber, particularly in things like trusses for roofs, where the horizontal may do that, lift, and suddenly you see a big gap between your ceiling and the wall or something, or it just causes a lot of distortion in your wall when you put up sheetrock and pop nails and all this sort of thing. So it's one of the hazards of this rapid growth southern pine that's in the market. And it's one of the reasons why now, for a while what happened, and I cover this on this paper, people started going to metal studs actually, Carpenters hate metal studs, they just hate to work with them, I relate to that. But, and so finally they just started coming up with engineered wood, particularly for joists. And the advantage of engineered wood for joists is not only that it's not going to bend and warp and twist, but it's also, you can get very long lengths that way, and you know that it's the same everywhere on it. So for some of those kinds of construction things, it makes a lot of sense. For boat building and furniture making, we like to just have wood of good quality. We don't want to have to build everything out of chipboard or something like that. So it's one of those tenuous areas that we have to deal with. A problem that occurs sometimes in hardwoods, and it's not so much of a problem around here, because we don't have the climate to grow things that rapidly anyway. But it happens a lot with species that have the potential to grow very rapidly, but in their native habitat they're growing in a dry climate. And this is true for a lot of Australian eucalypts. So Australia, as most of you know, is a lot of desert areas and very dry areas. And so the eucalypts have adapted to that and are very efficient at gathering up water. Well, a lot of these eucalypts have been planted in South Africa, where it's a much wetter area, and they grow very, very fast. And unfortunately, that produces a lot of internal stresses. So normally in a tree, the tree is under compression when the tree is young, and then as that is relieved and you produce more wood, that is relieved and actually the outer wood is under tension. And that is a fairly subtle difference, but it's there. That's why instrument builders like to have wood that's been sitting around for many, many, many years, so all those internal stresses are equilibrated. But here, those internal stresses become extreme, and so when they fell the tree, sometimes they just split apart. They actually put bands around the trees sometimes, so that when they fell them, they don't split apart. Or they start to fly apart on the saw. They actually build cages around the bandsaw so workers don't get injured when it starts flying. So this can be a problem for particularly diffuse porous woods. Some of that internal strain can be taken up in ring porous woods in the early wood zone, so weak anyway. But in diffuse porous hardwoods, it's more of a problem. Not a problem so much around here, but if you're buying wood on the world market, it can be something to think about. But we also have wood that has its own internal reaction wood that can be a defect for us trying to use it. Compression wood is what forms in conifers. It forms on the underside of a leaning stem or the underside of every branch. So any branch wood is going to have compression wood in it. And stems that have been leaning, maybe they were leaning in the past and not anymore, and you don't know this until you actually open up the stem. In hardwoods, it's called tension wood, and it forms on the upper side of the lean. It's less of a problem in hardwoods than it is in conifers. It makes the wood denser, so you think it's stronger, but it's not, and it has this microfibril angle problem with a lot of lignin in it, and that allows it to be strong in compression, but very weak in all other directions. So it's a wood that you really don't want to have. I think we're kind of skip over this and say I've pretty much mentioned all of the references that we have. And probably might be a good time to take a break and then have a coffee break and think about areas that we might explore, and we'll also start off with some wood identification after the break. One thing I skipped over here, and it's kind of important, particularly when I want to talk about these handouts that are from the Wood Handbook, is this issue of density versus specific gravity. The denser the wood, the heavier the wood, generally the stronger the wood. And this is true for most of the properties of the wood. And it holds up as long as you've got normal wood. If you have compression wood, then that changes. So we often like to know something about the density of one species versus another. So let's say we've been building with oak and we want to use some other wood. And so we can look in the handbook and see what its density is. Well, you won't find density. You'll find something called specific gravity. And the reason is that density, of course, is mass per unit volume. And specific gravity is the density of wood related to the density of water. And we choose cubic centimeter of water, and say its specific gravity is 1. So that reference then means that it helps us in a number of ways. First, if it's lighter, if it's got a specific gravity less than 1, it's not going to sink. You throw it into the water. It's got a specific gravity above, it's going to sink. Now, specific gravity and the density all change with the amount of moisture in wood. And so we choose a particular specific gravity for wood that we measure. We call it basic specific gravity, or G, and we measure it for green volume and oven dry weight. And the reason we chose these is that once wood gets to what's called fiber saturation point, which is usually around 25 to 30%, the wood doesn't swell anymore. You keep adding more water, but it's not swelling anymore because you've already filled all the cell walls, and now you're filling this space inside the cells, or the lumens. So if you were to just say, well, this wood at 50% moisture content has a density such and such, it doesn't have any meaning because it would have a higher density at 100% or 120%. The way we measure moisture content, it could be 300%. That's another question. But anyway, it's meaningless to us in terms of what its strength is. So we always choose to measure it at green volume, which is easy to measure. We know that that's always going to be the same, whether it's 30%, 50%, 100%, whatever moisture content. And oven dry weight, which we put it in an oven and we dry it until at a certain temperature until it doesn't lose any more water, and then we measure its volume. And for most woods, they have a basic G between 0.3. This one actually has a specific gravity of 0.26, so it's really, really light. Balsa is 0.15. But there are some woods like rosewoods and lignum vitae that are above 1, and so obviously they sink. One of the things that's interesting about this, oh, let me just say one other thing. So the specific gravity of the cell wall itself is 1.54 roughly. Different wood handbook uses that number, some others use slightly different, but around 1.5. So if you didn't have any airspace in the wood, it would all sink in that of those pieces because it's above the gravity of water. But of course, it has airspace. And woods that might have a basic specific gravity of, say, 0.8 still might sink if you just cut a green tree and you got all that water that's in it. So it turns out that many of the woods we have from the tropics are moderate to low density woods. Mahogany has a specific gravity of about 0.45. That's considered right kind of in the middle. And many of the others, Spanish cedar is even less than that. Many of the ones that we, for many years, were harvesting and getting from the tropics were moderate to low density woods because they got them out of the forest by waiting for the wet season and floating them out. And if they sunk, they just didn't go anymore. So they graft them up and ship them out. And only now are we starting to utilize higher density woods like Ipe, which you've probably heard of, or Decadence, or woods that are very high density woods because we don't harvest them and ship them out by water any longer from the forest. So that's sort of a little story about specific gravity and why you see specific gravity in the wood handbook. But it's a very nice, convenient way of doing it because if you had density, is it in pounds per cubic foot, is it metric, is it what, you have to do all these conversions and then try to think of what that means, but here, you're just always referencing it to water, and it's either, and you know that on average they're mostly between 0.3 and 0.8, so if you've got an oak that's 0.65 and a hickory that's 0.72, the hickory's a little heavier than oak, is that kind of thing. So it's a very convenient way of looking at it. So what we might do now is just look at a couple of things from the wood handbook for those who might want to use it in the future. By the way, you can download the wood handbook for free, but then you have this gigantic mass of stuff that's hard. I just can't deal with that kind of thing. But anyway, you know, I like to thumb through the book and I know where stuff is in the book and all that. So anyway, this first table, 310, the other thing is that this wood handbook that Leonard Lee did, the pages are numbered consecutively like most books. The wood handbook produced by the Porous Research Society has a different way of doing it. Chapter number followed by page number. So there's a little confusion there. But anyway, here we can see in a nice table what woods are going to give you the most decay resistance if you're doing boat building, if you're doing fencing, if you're doing outdoor furniture. So we have the list from bald cypress, alpha, cedars, cherry, chestnut. Black locust is probably our most decay resistant wood that we have. That was the wood I was trying to think of that was up on the board there. Unfortunately, a lot of black locust is kind of twisted and distorted that we have in this country. Just did a wooden boat column on it. In fact, in Europe, it does really well because they don't have the locust borer. And here, the locust borer just kind of ruins a lot of black locust. Anyway, those, and then some imported woods that are high Ipe. You can see on there, green heart. Green heart is not only decay resistant, it's also resistant to marine borers, mahoganies. Let me say something about mahogany, though. You'll notice mahogany American, and then if you go to moderately resistant, you get mahogany African, and then if you get over to lightly or non-resistant, you get Meranti. Anyone know what Meranti is? It's what we call Philippine mahogany, and is often just sold as mahogany, not even telling you it's Philippine mahogany. So it's not the same wood at all, and clearly not anywhere near the decay resistance of our American mahogany. The American mahogany referred to here is Sweet Tinea macrophylla, big leaf mahogany, which is the one we mostly get now. But the original mahogany that was actually shipped as ballast to England on ships going from Cuba back to England is Cuban mahogany, which is even a better quality wood, just wonderful wood. And that's what started the whole craze for mahogany, because the Queen wanted some furniture made, and of course once you had it made, everyone said, oh, you've got to have it too, and that's the Victorian era of mahogany furniture. But of course it is a really wonderful wood. Teak old growth, that brings up another issue. Teak has been planted all over the world now. A lot of it's being planted in Central America. That quality teak is not ideal for boat building or outdoor furniture making. It has a lot of sapwood. It grows on different soils. It does not produce the same kind of wood. So a lot of exotic woods, that is woods that are grown outside their normal place that they grow, produce wood that's quite different. In fact, there's a wood called the turpentine tree that's from Australia. It's the most resistant to marine borers of any wood that we know of. So the U.S. government, I think during World War II or I, started planting it in Hawaii. It doesn't have any marine borer resistance grown there. So that's something you need to really be aware of, is where you're sourcing, where your wood is coming from, as well as being aware that it's not depleting a valuable resource. Yeah.
If it's part of a plantation operation, but in the same country with the same climate,
It varies. There is plantation teak grown in Myanmar and other places that has good quality, and they've been growing it that way. In fact, there's very little forest-grown teak anymore. Most of it is plantation, even in some native countries, Burma and so on. So, if it's managed properly, if it isn't. This second page here, table 9.1, is just shows you what if you're going to glue some woods? Are they difficult to glue or are they easy to go through? This table gives you some of that. One of the ways you can test wood to see if it's going to glue well is to take a surface and smooth it up, preferably with a scraper or something with a sandpaper. And put a drop of water on there, and if it beads up and stays beaded up for quite a long time, you're going to have trouble gluing that wood. If, on the other hand, it spreads out within a reasonable period of time, because glue has to not only attach to the surface, but has to spread into the wood a short distance at least. So that's a good little test you can do for, and that test, by the way, is shown in the wood handbook, and it's got photos showing how to do that. Then I just wanted to spend a little time on this last page, which is strength properties of wood. And at first look, this probably just goes, ooh, I don't want to mess with this. There's a bunch of numbers all over the page. But let me try to break it down for you. The first column is moisture content. So we've already talked about green and 12%. Green is the same as what I call G, or basic specific gravity, green volume oven dry weight. So that you can take as a standard one to just compare with all the others. And they happen to do 12% just because that's a common sort of in between what we have inside here, which would be 6% maybe, and what you might have in a boat, which might be 18% or something like that. But probably if you just take the green one always and just compare it to other woods. So you really don't need to know what all these numbers mean under modulus of rupture, modulus of elasticity, work to maximum load holes. The numbers are meaningless. They have two tables actually to go on for several pages. One's metric, which is this one, kilojoules per meter. You can also get it in the English version of pounds per cubic foot, and that kind of stuff. Doesn't matter, just as long as you stick with one or the other. And then you just look at a number. So specific gravity, we've already talked about that. So you had something like white oak, specific gravity of 0.6, but then you've got live oak, which is 0.8. Live oak is actually, even though it's an oak, it's not ring porous, because it just continues, it holds its leaves all the time. And so a lot of oaks that grow in Mexico also are not ring porous, because they don't have that period when they drop their leaves. They just keep growing. They don't have those large early pores, so they're very, very dense wood, very strong woods. Live oak is, for many years, you couldn't cut it without a permit from the Navy because they ordered it all for naval ships. It's so wonderful oak. You can look at walnut and yellow poplar, for instance, and you can say, well, if I want a lighter weight piece of furniture or something, I could stain it to look like walnut, and there it is. But I'm just throwing out stuff. But anyway, then these three other things are static bending elasticity E on this is actually what's called modulus of elasticity on this chart. If you just wrote above that stiffness, that's a measure of how stiff the wood is. Modulus of rupture, the one before it, is if you take a beam and you apply a load very slowly to it and it finally breaks. It's what is the load that it took to finally cause that beam to break. That's modulus of rupture. It's a slowly applied load. And then compression parallel to the grain is if, like, you want to know of a post or something, how strong it's going to be, you know, you're applying a force. Now, work to maximum load, you can ignore that for now. Impact bending, what would be nice if they had on here is toughness. Toughness is not measured that often. It's in some tables in the book, but only for a few woods. Toughness is how strong a wood is if you apply a very rapid load, an impact load. So this is sort of like that, but this is done in a weird way in which they drop a ball, and if it didn't break, they take it to a higher level and drop it again. So each time you're damaging the wood a little bit, so it's not the best test in the world, but it's what they do a lot because it's easy. The way you do toughness is actually you take a beam and you have a pendulum, and you know that you've got enough weight on it that it's going to break that beam. And so you measure the angle when you start and then measure the angle when you end. And that, converted through some manipulation, gives you a measure from one wood to another how tough it is. Toughness is an important value for boat building, for one thing, you know, pounding around in the waves and stuff. Anything where you might, baseball bats, tool handles, anything, hockey sticks, anything that's going to be getting, you know, that kind of rough treatment. Work to maximum load, in a sense, is also a way of looking at it. So both work to maximum load and impact bending, because we don't have toughness itself, are measures that you can look at to get a rough idea of one wood to another on how good it is under rapidly applied load. These others are shear is how easy it is to split a wood. Elm would have a very high shear value because it's got interlocked grain, as anyone's known who's tried to split elm. So those, you know, the ones you mostly are going to look at is MOR and MOE, modulus of rupture, modular elasticity, and just compare it from one wood to another. You get a good idea then, along with their specific gravity. You know, specific gravity is a good general measure, but you may find your wood that you're comparing with another might have similar specific gravity but somewhat different MOR and MOE, or they might, you know. So those things allow you to sort of just do comparisons, and you really need to know the numbers, or don't need to know what they are because you're just going to compare it with one wood you already know. Okay, let's these are hand lenses, so take one hand lens and pass them on. How much time do we have? Kind of running out of time. Any questions of areas that you want to go into before we get into the wood ID? What we're going to do is just look at 3 woods. We're going to look at red oak, white oak, and chestnut. You might wonder why the heck are we going to look at chestnut? Well, if you ever go to buy furniture at an auction or used furniture in a yard sale, some of that that's sold as oak furniture is actually chestnut. And of course, you know there's no chestnut around anymore, so that furniture has a higher value than that person was suggesting. It could also be black ash, which looks somewhat similar. But we're going to look at the way you tell them apart. Oaks are fairly easy to tell apart. Well, let me get the woods passed out first, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, take one of those. You're going to have to make a smooth surface on the cross section. So I'm passing out razor blades. Don't use them until I describe how to use them. Now, if you have a really, really sharp knife, it can work okay, but single-edged razor blade probably gives you the smoothest surface. The first thing is that, if everyone can just watch me here for a minute, do not let your thumb stick up there. See what happened to that thumb? No, it actually had on a table saw. I always like to say that. The thumb must be down here. All fingers must be below this top surface. And what you want to do is hold the razor blade between your thumb and the second finger and use your index finger kind of as a backing on the backing. This is why we don't use a double finger. And you make a slicing motion. It's not just pushing, but also slicing a little bit this way. So you just do it like that. And you don't need to make a very large area. Those areas that I've made are large enough for most woods. Sometimes you need to, and rather than trying to make that larger, make another area, make several of them, and then you can look at different places in the wood. If it's very wide growth wood, then you may have to make several of them to find different parts of the ring. Any questions on that? Just be very careful when using these razor blades. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can tell, number one, whether you have an oak. By the way, chestnut is closely related to the oaks. It's a different genus, but it's the same general family. They're all ring porous, as you'll see. So they have this band of early wood pores and then a zone of late wood. For many people, the way they separate white oak from red oak is to look to see if there are what's called tyloses in the vessels. So maybe instead of looking now, just look up here on the board and I'll just explain how to separate them and then we'll go ahead and do it. So in white, this is white oak, and yet I don't see much in the way of tyloses in there. You probably will in the wood you have. But I point this out because here you do have tyloses, these plugs that are in the cells, and that's what makes white oak, most white oaks, more resistant to water movement through the wood, and that's why we use white oak for barrels that are going to hold liquids, and red oak for barrels that are called slack cooperage, which hold only dry goods. So because of that fact that the tyloses are not always very present in all white oaks, we use another way of separating red oak from white oak. And that is to look at the late wood. And in the late wood, we see the late wood pores in both cases are in this sort of flame-shaped tracts. But in red oak, they're larger, circular, and fewer. So they're very easily seen. Whereas in white oak, they're numerous, crowded, and small, and angular. So this sort of crowded, small, hard to see late wood pores versus fairly easy to see, less numerous late wood pores is how we separate red oak from white oak. Now, how do we know that it's definitely oak and not some other ring porous hardwood? You see these rays? Oak has very, very wide rays. That's what gives you that ray fleck on the radial surface that's so highly prized in craftsman furniture. And in between those wide rays, it has uniseriate rays. that are just one cell wide and very difficult to see. So wide rays, there's a wide ray, fairly wide ray, wide ray, and uniseriate rays in between. Having told you that, how do we separate chestnut from oak?
Doesn't have those rays?
No wide rays.
Yeah.
Only uniseriate rays. So if you get something that looks like oak, but you don't find the wide rays, you have chestnut. Now obviously, that's about all we can do within the limits of what we have here, but at least it shows you sort of the methodology and kind of what you're going to be doing and looking for. I could show you maybe. We don't have time to probably do another one, but for instance, if we were going to do a conifer, we might look to see whether, like for instance, if we want to separate hemlock from spruce or fir from spruce, hemlock has no resin canals, whereas spruce does. So here we have spruce over here with resin canals. They're quite small, a little hard to see. If you had larger resin canals, it would be probably white pine, and hemlock doesn't have any resin canals. So these are the kind of little things that we look for, and it can get pretty tedious. But if you were to get Bruce Hoadley's book, it would get you started and get you on the road to figuring out a lot of this. I often take a hand lens to the lumber yard, not just to identify it, but to look for other things like sometimes, or a little razor blade or knife, so I can make sure I can really see the ring width or something like that. You know, most of the time it shows up pretty well without doing anything. While we're doing that, if anyone has any other areas we'd like to cover, question, agree with that also. Yeah.
I know you've looked at musical instrument with choices. A few years ago, I bought a guitar to teach myself to play. It's a nice work. But I've just learned that the body is made of a composite and not a single.
It's sort of rounded rather than...
It's not rounded.
Because there is one that's made that way.
It's a Martin and it's made...
Oh, one of the new Martins, yeah.
They've got a laminated neck, which I understand for strength, but the body, got spruce top, but the body has been painted to look like it's mahogany. Well, it looks like it's...
All right, well, let me say a little something about, I play guitar, mandolin, banjo, and sort of looked into violin and stuff. The most important part of a stringed instrument is the top. That's really the vibration that occurs there, and the tone is set up there. So, you want something similar in a guitar and a violin or mandolin, but not always the same, because a mandolin and a violin have an arched top. So that wood is under compression by the strings as they come over the bridge. Whereas a guitar top, unless it's tied to the end, if it just goes to the bridge, the string for the bridge is actually being pulled up rather than being pushed down. And what you want is something that's light and that will, vibrate that way. Whereas in a violin, the compression strength is quite important, as well as these other things for tone. So tone and spruce and almost all musical instruments like that are either made out of spruce or cedar sometimes, or redwood occasionally. You want kind of a different, softer tone. But spruce is sort of all violins and most guitars. But there are even differences between spruce. So Adirondack spruce has a higher value than citrus spruce. It has a higher value than some other western spruces and so on. German spruces have high value. And if you go to the wood handbook, you can actually check their values. So if you look at, say, MOE, that's modular elasticity, how stiff a wood is, and divide it by specific gravity, you can get a value that you can compare from one wood to another. And the higher that value is, the better it's going to be for a guitar or a violin. Most of the sound is transmitted in the late wood. So the violins that were built by Stradivari and Guarneri were built out of woods that were harvested during what's called the Maunder minimum. It was a period of time when it was extremely cold, and wood all comes from spruce in the Italian Alps. So that's one factor. So there's a lot more late wood because they're narrow rings. The other thing is that they were sluiced down off the mountain and out to the Bay of Naples, and they often sat there for about 5 years because Naples controlled everything in terms of who got what and when they would be shipped. It sat in seawater for about 4 or 5 years. So it soaked up salts. And there have been studies that have been done that show that chloride salts improve compression strength of softwoods. And most of it was done on red pine, which is studies done back in the 40s and 50s. The other thing that happens is that bacteria in the seawater break down the pit membrane. So this torus and this largo around it are lost. It's actually primarily carbohydrate rather than cellulose and lignin. So bacteria break that down, and now that creates a longer column of air that's, in theory, at least, might.
That leads to an improvement in tone too then?
So it could be a factor in improving the tone. So a lot of what we attribute to the, Stradivari and Guarneri were wonderful guitar violin makers, but they also had some other factors going on that we can't duplicate exactly today. There is a guy in Texas who's researched this a lot. He's actually soaked wood in salt water or in various salts, and then built violins. People have tried them; they're really nice sound. For many years, people have always said it's the varnish, it's the varnish, it's the varnish. The varnish is nothing. The varnish has nothing to do with it. It's the wood, and it's how the wood was grown. That's the story. I'm sticking with it. Now the back and side do create a different quality of tone, but for volume and rapid response, you know, when you hit that string and you're going to hit another string right after it, so on, rapid response, you know, and otherwise it just becomes sort of a muddy sound. So it's a late wood that allows for that rapid response of the sound. And so, you know, they build instruments where they make the guitar top as thin as possible without, you know, breaking. Of course, Martin introduced X bracing, which is the standard now for all guitars. But I have a Martin guitar from the 1850s that preceded their X bracing. So it's got Brazilian rosewood also, of course. If you want Brazilian rosewood in your guitar now, just double the price of whatever you going to pay for East Indian rosewood, because it's been banned from export since the 80s. Martin actually stopped using it in the 70s before it was totally banned. It has a wonderful sound. And you can't, if you get one made out of Brazilian, you have to get a certificate with it, or else you can't carry it out of the country. Take it away from it. These customs, it's like ivory.
You can't take it out of Brazil?
Can't take it out of this country, unless you have a certificate even indicating that it's of a certain age prior to the ban. or that was made from wood that had already been imported before the ban. I don't know if I can say more. I was almost going to bring some instruments, but I had so much else to bring, and I didn't know what anyone's interest was anyway. But, interesting.
Well, of course, you use wood for sounding boards and pianos also.
Spruce is also used there.
But
But the piano, the big problem there is that the sounding board is actually held under compression. And interestingly enough, Steinway, that's not his original name, was Steinberg or something like that. It came from Germany the same time that Martin came over, in the 1830s. And they both built these companies based on. They've both been luthiers, and the reason they left Germany is that they weren't in the right guild. Yes. So they were in furniture making guild or some other guild, and they weren't supposed to be making guitars and stuff like that. So, but Steinway got sold a number of times. It was a family run. Well, Martin is still a family run. C.F. Martin IV is the current owner of Martin Guitar. Great grandson. And but Steinway got sold in the 80s to some guys who did plastic, other things. Yeah, one of them was a group of people, and it's been sold a few times. And they had some bad times in the 80s. A lot of their soundboards were cracking because they were trying to rush the thing through too quick, allowing it to equilibrate and dry long enough and all that. But they've kind of come out of that funk a bit now. But for a while, Steinway was in kind of trouble because they hired people. And it wasn't the workers; they wanted to do it the right way. But the guys said, "No, we got to get these out of the factory and move along."
Well, do you know the piano company in Italy, Fazioli?
I don't know that one.
Well, they're only about maybe 30 years old, and they only make about 60 to 80 pianos a year. And they're very expensive, but they're just incredible. And the son was almost a concert pianist. I mean, he was just on the edge of being good enough. But his family owned a furniture business. He said, "Dad, I want to build pianos." And he said, "Go for it." Yeah. And they're probably the best piano made today. And they pick every piece of wood for their sounding boards they pick personally.
There's a German company that I know of that's still old school that way also, and makes some wonderful pianos. In fact, I'm a founding member of a group called Greenwood. It's a NGO working in Honduras and other countries in Central America, helping the local people use the forest sustainably and make furniture and stuff. And one of our board members was Silas Kopp. I don't even know that name. He's probably the most well-known not in Tarzan. He's done pianos for Steinway. So we were trying to see if we would do one with this German piano company and raffle it off and get some money for it. If you're interested in that, actually it's on, oh no, I had it on, just go to greenwoodglobal.org and you'll find our website on the top. So, have anyone been able to see the differences then between the
This has got to be the chestnut, right?
Hmm?
This has got to be the chestnut.
Have you looked at it?
I thought I did. I didn't see any of those bands, did I?
No? Okay then, that probably is. Yes, that's the chestnut.
Huh?
Yeah, that's chestnut. Anyone else want to hazard some guesses?
Straight up.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
Do you know So I can't remember her first name, but Anisotropic, Connecticut. She works on chestnuts. Anisotropic.
No, but we have a chestnut program here in Maine, going also.
Where is it located?
Well, some of it was down in some of the early plantations were in the Camden area. But I'm not sure where they all are. But they're actually out also searching for. They found some mature chestnut up in the Atkinson area. But they're doing, mostly what they're doing in all these plantations now is back crossing.
Yes.
You just keep back crossing, choosing, expose them to the fungus and choose the ones that make it and keep back crossing until you get closer and closer to the American. Yeah, and actually I have one planted in my yard. There's no chestnut near me anyway, so I don't think it's going to get it anyway, but the blight.
There's a chestnut in Prospect Harbor, right over 86.
A good sized one? Yeah. Yeah, there's some scattered around. That's another thing about once you learn about kinds of these 4 groups of wood that I've talked about, you get some insight into diseases that can attack. So oak wilt, chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease are all attack green porous hardwoods because they get into the vessels and form these tyloses that block the water from moving up, and then you get the wilting. So fungi that can get in and cause a reaction in the vessels that cause the crank. Actually, tyloses are formed. You can go into this. If this is a vessel, one of these large vessels that we saw on boats and things, surrounding them are parenchyma cells. These are living cells, and what happens is the fungus gets into these vessels, and then it starts to penetrate into the parenchyma cell, and it causes a reaction, and the parenchyma cell simply blebs out its cytoplasm into the vessel, and that's what tyloses are. It's actually the cytoplasm with like a primary wall built around it. That's actually how tyloses form. So if you look at sapwood of a ring porous hardwood that has tyloses, it doesn't have tyloses yet. It happens when that converts to heartwood, and these parenchyma cells dump out their contents and create these tyloses into the vessels. But fungus then can cause it to happen in the sapwood, which is of course where all the water. Sapwood is where all the water moves up. The heartwood is not doing anything in terms of the function of the tree other than helping to hold it up. So yeah. I don't know if I have any more nuggets.
We should probably wrap up. Schedule to get on the road, but if folks could join me and get your hands.
If any of you want to keep those 3 woods, you're welcome to.
We would ask that you not keep my handlines.
Yeah, not the handlines.
Can't use those for future classes.
So how do we put the bird down when the bird's down there?
Well,